Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome. My name is Melissa Ngan, President and CEO of the American Composers Orchestra. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's professional development session. This is part of a series that we are curating as part of our Earshot Composer Advancement Programs and in partnership with the American Composers Forum. Today's session is titled The Gainfully Employed Composer, and I'm joined today by composer and curator Dan Visconti. Dan is a Rome and Berlin Prize-winning composer whose music is rooted in the improvisational energy and maverick spirit of rock, folk, and other vernacular traditions. He is a TED Fellow. He also serves as artistic director of Astral Artists, where he develops the early careers of extraordinary classical musicians. We are also going to be welcoming some of our Earshot composers on screen with us during the session today as well. So please don't hesitate to raise your hands during the session if you have questions. We would love to hear from you and see you during the session. And we're really looking forward to today's conversation. A couple of quick tech reminders. Feel free to use the Q&A button below the video to submit any questions in writing. We'll have time to answer anytime during the session. So feel free to put that in anytime you have a question. You're also welcome to use the chat function to interact with your fellow attendees. And we're also recording this and making it available on our YouTube channels as well. And a few notes of thanks. I'd like to thank those who are making this series possible, including the American Composers Forum, the Virginia B. Tolman Foundation, the New York State Council on the Arts, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, our individual donors, and our ACO staff, Lindsay Working, Aidan Feldkamp, Stephen Baer, Derek Bermel, and Sydney Cusick. So with that, I want to welcome Dan. How are you today?
Hi, Melissa. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to have you. And so we're here to talk about the process of becoming and sustaining a career as a gainfully employed composer. And we have many people in the webinar today at various stages of their careers. We're really excited that through Earshot, we're working with composers who are really going to redefine the American orchestral experience through the music that they make. But before we begin, before we talk about all of the nuts and bolts, I'm curious if you could share a little bit about some of the questions that you might suggest asking yourself before you start this process of considering what your career may look like in a sustainable sense.
Well, thanks, Melissa. Well, first of all, I just want to say, I was just looking at the ACO logo and it's actually really beautiful colors. So I love the cut of ACO's jib. Thanks again for having me. And I really love the beautiful community that you've been creating around developing careers and tackling really difficult issues like this. This is going to be a real nuts and bolts seminar. So, some of the questions that I think about, I'll coalesce around knowing yourself. And I think it also has to do with realizing that writing music is just a tiny part of the business and life of writing music. So if you want to just write some music for yourself, maybe pass it around, if you're not trying to turn it into a career, trying to make the most out of it, that's a very different kind of thing than the business of being a composer. And one thing I found out is that, at the time when I became most active, I would say that maybe no more than 50% of my time as a quote composer was actually spent writing music. So I think getting a sense for that ratio and one's own appetite for doing all the other kind of supportive work, I think it's a great chance for composers to learn a lot about themselves and their own limits in the process of learning how they can support the great creative work they're doing and best be supporting and presenting it. So things that you might not think about at first, and that I'm sure a lot of you are already doing, watching, things like copying, engraving, binding, dealing with physical distribution, if you're dealing with that, managing records and invoices, if you're moving a lot of materials, things like grant writing and support, flying for meetings in order to get interest in projects and driving them through, public speaking, writing, content creation. There's so much more than just composing that goes into being a composer. I think curating is a big one of them, dealing with recording, engineering skills, underwater basket weaving. Composers do a lot of different stuff. So, as we take stock of this, the thing that I would urge all of you to consider is ask the question, am I someone who can actually do this myself? Not everyone is actually equipped to do this kind of stuff. Or some people can only do so with some things and not in all areas. Those might require some additional learning. So this is an area where you first have to see what your own capabilities are to know if you're going to be able to do this long-term. Self-publishing won't be a good thing for you if you're not good at self-publishing. It's kind of self-explanatory, but everything here is not necessarily just objective without context. It's all in the context of who you are, how you work, and if you're actually going to do a good job managing this. So you want to be realistic You also want to seek outside opinions. One of the best ways to figure this question out is not just to sit and muse. Ask people that you know, other composers, performers, especially people that you've worked with in settings that are collaborative. Ask them for some really honest feedback. The more you can be really open to any kind of feedback about that, you'll learn a lot. I find that it's hard to see myself without a mirror. So take advantage of that community that you're cultivating and activate that ability to see yourself through others and get some honest feedback. And sometimes that can really help you head off going into something that you may not be able to sustain. So a realistic assessment will help you drive growth. It's going to let you know which areas you need to invest in more. It's going to let you know where you need more allies in your journey. Maybe self-publishing is a really great idea for you, but you just need a couple additional skills. So these questions are going to help you focus that, figure where you can do that. The last thing I would say is that any ways that you can apprentice or pick up skills on the job are going to be really, really essential. And a big thing that we always like to think about is that there's no job that's a totally bad job, as long as you're able to learn a skill from it that's useful to you for your larger purposes and dreams. So, you might have some really amazing, prestigious job. You might have a job in the arts or administration. You might have a job doing something totally outside of the arts, or picking up a skill, or even picking up a mindset, picking up a certain attitude and a certain level of discipline. Those are things that you can all apply. So going into it, I think that we need to do a little bit of soul searching as composers and try and see where our strengths and weaknesses are. And I think that's going to inform the building out of the actual process and resources that we need around us.
That makes great sense. And so when you said earlier that you spent 50% of your time writing music and 50% not writing music, that is at a stage in your career when you were already considering yourself a full-time composer. So really that other 50% was like managing the stuff around being a composer. Is that right?
Absolutely. And some of that was things like dealing with inquiries for sales and rentals. And sometimes just those are very clear cut and there's just a volume of them to fulfill. Sometimes there's conversations around those. And as we'll get to later, one of the best reasons to self-publish is it positions you to be in touch with the people that are actually interested in your music and to make it very easy process for them. So that's something that no one is ever going to care about as much as you. So I spent a lot of time doing that, but also things like writing grants to support projects. Projects generate a lot of different kinds of paths. So all of the work to fulfill those things and managing projects in multiple stages. I might be finishing one piece in the middle of another and just having conversations about starting one. So sometimes there's different kinds of mind or different kinds of hats that we wear at different times. And the sense of balance or capacity for each of those is different for everyone.
Yeah, for sure. And it might help contextually for people to know that within your career, at least a large portion of it, you've made your living as a composer, as a freelance composer, as opposed to having, an academic role or something else like that, which would take up a huge chunk of your time. Is that right?
That's correct. And, I've definitely been really involved in teaching, education, but I've never really been a full-time professor. I've been doing a lot of work developing, commissioned work and projects, consulting, things like that. But I'm really happy that I had the chance to kind of focus on that level because it also let me know what my own limits were. One of the suppositions I had when I was a 20-something little pup, I'm getting pretty old now, I'm almost 40. And I had this thought, it'd be so great if I could make a career just writing commissions. And I had one year where I think I did something like 11 pieces that were all on some kind of commission. And, some like 3 of them were really big, a couple of them were smaller. And it was just an astronomical amount, but I never would have realized what that limit was. So I think especially when we're in that quote emerging stage that we hear bandied around so much, it's a great time to be testing your own limits in a managed way, carefully, but to see where that limit is so that you can go up to that and then ride a little beyond it so you don't get burned out and figure out what's actually sustainable.
That is such a great point because I know many of us are dealing with burnout in varying and new ways. So especially during this pandemic. So I really appreciate you bringing that up as a concept. And I also want to really underline what you said about learning on the job. I get that question all the time. What would it be like for me to get into a job in X? My biggest advice is exactly what you said. Take a role in that for a period of time. Sometimes the idea of something is really, really different from the actual practice of it. So I also really appreciate that you were saying you got to figure out what you're good at and build that extra skill set around that. And there are going to be moments where you either decide I'm going to do this for myself, or I'm going to hire a team or another person to join me in that journey. So self-publishing can be one of those avenues where you make a choice. So I wonder if you're thinking about that decision of whether you want to self-publish or consider a relationship with a publisher, what are some of the factors that are going to go into your decision?
Well, that's a really interesting question. And I think when you start with that soul searching I mentioned, first of all, I think let's look at the benefits of self-publishing and then the benefits of working with a publisher. So, there's many great things about being self-published. That thing I mentioned earlier, the opportunity for personal contact with the people that are actually interested in performing your music. That's priceless. That's something that we're actually working very hard to do. So it actually occurs in some ways as a byproduct of trying to make these other kinds of self-publishing moves to get our music out there. We don't want to ignore the fact that it's people that we're in touch with. So that's all important. I just want to hugely highlight that. Also, you have a lot of control of your own response time. Now, if you're not great at quick response time, or you simply don't have the capacity, that doesn't help much. But I'll bring it up because a lot of big publishers are notoriously slow, especially if you're a very small chamber series or something like that. It's often something where they're not quite as motivated as they're never going to be as motivated as the creator is. So realizing that you have a lot of agency there, if nothing else, you also have a lot of control of your own image, of your materials, how they look. And that's something that, again, might be to your advantage if you're really skilled at doing that, if you're really savvy. May not be to your advantage if you don't know anything about that, if you're weak at notation, if you don't have a broad knowledge of what music should look like from the perspective of different people who might have to learn your music without your help being there. Also, being able to work digitally is important. I know this is changing. We've got a lot more digital rentals, stuff like that, PDFs from all the major publishers. But, as recently as about 10 years ago, that was almost not the case at all. So things are starting to catch up. But I expect that nimbleness is something that will continue, and it's really important. So, you can be small but mighty as a self-published composer. And as we'll get to when we look at some case studies, some of the most successful composers in the world, like Jennifer Higdon, are completely self-published and very successful and profitable doing that, and have had many offers to switch over and said, nope, I like this too much. It's too good for me. The last thing I want to say about benefits for self-publishing is that the retention of your own copyright as a composer, that's really important. Now, when we're talking about the business of composing, you almost never want to give up your copyright. Typically, when you do a commission, say, the orchestra doesn't own the copyright to that piece. They may have a certain option on performing it, certain things you've contracted, but the composer keeps that copyright. The sole exception that you should consider is when you're actually working with a publisher. It's typical that that's part of a transfer, at least for certain pieces that are under agreement. So, and that's something that can end up being worth a whole lot if you have a piece that's a huge hit. So the ability to keep that copyright to be self-determined is really important. And again, it's more important if you're really good at knowing how to leverage that. So then that allows you to keep 100% of the profit. Now we come to some of the benefits of a publisher. And this is a nice pivot point because keeping 100% of the profit is great. But 100% of 3 performances is not as good as 10% of 100 performances. So we really need to think about what could a publisher actually do for us in our particular case. And one thing I would say about publishing is that it becomes increasingly less helpful to composers, I feel like, as they advance their career more and more. So for example, for a young composer who's just made some big waves, who gets noticed by one of the major publishers, by Schirmer, by Boozy, by Shaw, like that would be a really wonderful career boost to sign on and to work with a publisher potentially. But for a composer who's already figured out a lot of self-publishing, maybe it's a good flow, it might not be so attractive to switch over at a later point when you're already on the map. So thinking about the point where that option intersects, I also just want to point out that for a lot of us, this isn't so much a choice of which will I do. The vast majority of composers are currently and will be right now self-published. So the thing is, it's something that, like it or not, often that's where we start. Often that's our only option for a while. And the good news here is the same actions you need to take to be really a total whiz at being a self-publisher. Those are the same actions you need to do to be attractive to a potential publisher, because they want to know a lot of things. Danny Dorff, who's VP of Publishing at Presser, has pointed out that he spends so much time focused on a composer's career and how they develop it and their own personal voice. He spends a lot of time focusing on notation because the state that music is submitted to publishers affects a lot of what their investment has to be. So, there's definitely pros and cons to it. A big con I want to underline again is you don't have your copyright, you transfer that over and you're going to transfer a large part of the income. So, and this is where I think a big thing I want to end with is that ultimately publishing comes down to distribution. If you have a publisher who's going to really get your name out there, and I would think a little bit about, as a composer, do you find right now you're more of a generalist, or are you increasingly having areas of specialization? If you're really tearing it up writing awesome orchestra opener pieces, or you're specializing in choral music, or you specialize in, electronica or some kind of awesome cross-genre collaboration, that's going to be something where a publisher might be able to get you to a very focused niche that is better going to be able to, represent you. So it's kind of like if you want to do saxophone works, LeDuc could be a really, really good partner. So those are some things that I think about either way.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. And I also want to just underline again what you said about the idea that the same actions you take to become successfully self-published are the same actions that you would take to attract a publisher. So it's actually the same in the early stages. The same is true for management. If you're a performer, often people will say a good manager will probably only become interested in you when you have proven that you can do that work for yourself. So it's an interesting perspective to take on at the beginning. Is there anything else that you might say for people who might be considering working with a publisher? What specifically is the publisher there to do for you on your behalf?
So this will vary for publisher to publisher, but I would say these are the constants that I think you could rely on. First of all, is that they're going to assist you in the preparation of the draft score to the final version. So that's the first part of it on the most basic level. Number two is they're going to work with you on overall career planning. Every publisher is going to have some interest in your overall career's health and longevity and livelihood, right? And then I think the other component, and this is maybe more of the wild card where there's the most variation, has to do with exactly what they're going to be doing as far as working out direct commissions, deals like that. Because it could be that somebody does a great job getting existing pieces programmed. Somebody else might do a great job working out commissions for large projects. So those are the things to think about. And one of the ways that you can tell is if there's certain composers that you're wild about that are like a little farther along or a lot farther along than you are, track them. And what I mean by tracking is don't copy everything they do. Look at the things that they've done. Look at the awards they've won recently. Look at what's getting published. And if they're working with a particular publisher, look at the kinds of things that are getting worked out. That can help you sniff out a little bit what might be good. So those are some things that I might think about as some of the tricks.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And also you'd mentioned that, one of the downsides might be that for better or for worse, that publisher is going to represent you in the marketplace, right? So the way that they interact with people who want to buy your music or want to rent your music or perform your music, I've definitely been on the side of wanting to perform something and not having access to it because the publisher would not get back to me in any reasonable fashion. So I've definitely been in that position. Speaking of inquiries around pieces, we have a question here in the Q&A. So let's say that you are self-published in this situation. Any suggestions for when you receive an inquiry about a piece and then you respond back and then you never again hear from the conductor who reached out to you in the first place? How do you handle that situation?
That old canard, that's what always happens, right? So that's a difficult situation. You're going to need some patience, but here's a couple of things that I found are helpful. So the amount of times that it seems socially acceptable to directly nudge a contact for a particular piece of information are very limited before that person might not get perturbed, but if they're in a position of not needing something, they might just walk away if it's not a super pleasant interaction. So I would think about the number of ways that you can reduce that kind of interaction and change it into better ones. So here's some better ones. If you can contact again, but make it because you have new information that you're just sharing. It could be you just had a new performance or review of that piece. You've got something new, but then it's a little bit more, hey, just staying in touch. And of course, the effect is to kind of nudge that, but you don't even have to mention that other thing. It can be a little bit softer. It's more just a way to stay in touch. I don't know if you've ever had the experience of blowing off an email. I mean, I've never done this. I'm such an angel for like so long that you look at it and you go, oh, and it actually creates this additional pressure to write back because you feel like that person will be so upset. And you just want to write, I haven't heard from you. I'm getting really upset. So you want to make it as easy as possible for people to come. So kind of the last thing I would say on that line is mailing lists can be really helpful. A mailing list is one of those things when it was first told to me, I thought was kind of like perfunctory, like it sounds good to do, but how does it really help? For composers, it's so important. So you don't need to do this every month, even something like twice a year, 4 times a year, consistent. But it's a great way to kind of nudge those contacts. The amount of times that there was a conductor of some importance who had kind of gone totally silent and then wrote back, not to the original email thread, but to the email update saying, Dan, congrats, just thinking of you in this piece. How would next season be? So, and I didn't expect that to happen, but I think having a lot of contact points where you can be in touch with people without being pushy, just to be interacting is really good. And that goes for in person as well, when it's possible.
100%. And I'm just going to refer back to our last seminar that we did on networking because it mirrors exactly what you were saying in that process. So thank you so much for that. If you didn't catch it, it's on our YouTube channel, please do. So I want to hop now because we were talking about self-publishing as a skill set that is necessary for some at early stages of their career, and then for many throughout their careers. What are some of the other employable skills, some of the other ways that composers can make money that are tangentially related to what they do? So I want to invite anyone who is watching to use the chat window to put any ideas that you have about related skills. And I want to just uplift Daniel's comment from earlier. Like, love the point about taking all kinds of jobs, including copyists, producing, conducting, teaching, administrative. No such thing as wasted work. So he's getting us started with that list. So please feel free to populate the chat. And Dan, I know you're going to walk us through some of the potential options for how that might play out.
Sure. And it's great to see what everyone writes. I always find that there's things that other participants bring up in these kind of workshops that I think I never thought of that. So I think some of the reason for that is that composers are just such a natural fit for so many kinds of tasks that involve things that don't look like what are labeled classical contemporary composition, but that function with the same kind of thinking. So again, parallel process, thinking about how things actually work, not how they look on the surface, going deeper. And I think when you do that, you realize that composers are people that are great at tasks that involve creative vision. They're great at designing a process, sometimes with the help of people who have more on the ground knowledge of production or about overall practicality. But nevertheless, that's a big skill. And creating large scale work and seeing it through to completion over time. Those are things that actually are very rare for a lot of other jobs. And of course, that can be something that often composers work better either individually or collaboratively as a team. Some people do well as both, but I think there's so many different kinds of skills that come from that. So just realize that when we talk about the overall kinds of skills that will factor into more specific examples I'm about to bring up, it's really about pivoting not just from, well, I create music, but it's about a certain kind of mindset. It's about a certain kind of question. And just as people create music in so many different kinds of ways, composers develop skills and interests too. So let that individuality lead you. So some things that I've noticed both with myself and other composers that I've worked with, some of the things you see are writing. It could be articles, blogging, liner notes for CDs, reviews. That could be PR work, the ability to craft great copy or descriptions of things that are artful. That's really important. So there's so many ways that you could be helpful and also learning from different kinds of art organizations and engaging some of those skills and also, brushing up your own ability to work on your own bio, all those kind of things. So I think about public speaking, video, content creation, and that's an area that already was strong before the pandemic. But I think that that's just affirmed that this kind of stuff is here to stay, and more creative and interactive solutions are going to be exactly the kind of things that composers are required to figure out. I think about curation, programming. I've been an artistic director of a few different organizations, and I think that is such a natural fit for composers. What's weird? It's almost never taught in school. Like if you get a comp degree, no one's ever going to talk to you about curation. Or if you do, it's going to be really thin. It's going to be about ordering the pieces like a still life. So getting experience in working with all kinds of collaborating across genres, designing the concerts and events for non-traditional spaces, or all those things are things that are really, really exciting today and people are interested in it. Composers can really be at the forefront of those explorations. Also, other kinds of artistic administration, production, depending on your personality and interest, there's a spot for you along a team. So I think about that. Other categories, recording, engineering, all those kind of things. Again, depending on your interest, depending on your own needs, that can be a great fit. So many things that come out of familiarity with technology and that can start with just being really good at Finale and Sibelius. You can do copying, you can do engraving, you can help with arrangements, but you also do web design, you can do coding potentially. So that opens up so much, and that can help with clients who are composers or musicians, or clients who work in very different sectors. Let's not forget teaching, education, design, tutoring. There's all different kinds of ways that you can be helpful. Of course, there's commissions. I wanted to save that for a little bit later because that's the obvious one. But there's commissions for a string quartet, an orchestra piece. But there's also arranging and transcriptions for private clients. The amount of people out there who have written a melody to a song and want help creating an accompaniment and writing it down and have a great deal of money, it continues to surprise me. And that can be really good at a particular point. For me, that was really good when I was finishing up grad school and coming out. That's not as much something that is a great investment for me now all the time, but at a particular point in my life, in a particular context, that was helpful. So as you consider all these things, keep in mind that none of them are in the abstract. They're all going to relate to you in different ways. So be flexible. They might relate to you differently at different times in life. And the more that you can actually create opportunities for those to change and to learn and reflect from them, that's important. So one thing I want to toss in here before we go on that might seem like a little bit non sequitur is keep a journal. I just want to mention it because there's never a good spot in this talk to say it, but we need time to reflect and absorb. And sometimes some of the things you can do are keep track of some of your goals, keep track of some of your biggest achievements. It won't make a lot of sense when you do it once, but looking back over 5 years about your greatest goals, your greatest defeats, your greatest achievements, the things you're most excited about can reveal trends, and it can reveal growth when you feel stuck. And it can, because we're on that continuum, when we feel like we're not moving, it can actually give us hope that we are moving actually, and it can guide us. So those are just some things I think about that can help a little bit. It's a very big topic, but that's just a smattering of things that I think sometimes we don't always think about all of them. So
for sure. I mean, there's so much gold in what you just said. And I think what you just said about feeling encouragement at a difficult moment, I often find that I feel the worst when I'm accomplishing the most. And probably the closest to the next sort of plateau. So that journal is a way of sort of keeping that objective. You also mentioned curation as one of the processes. And because, a lot of the composers who are watching today are interested in writing for orchestra, and we're, with Earshot looking to create successful relationships between composers and orchestras in the long term, right? Being able to think about ways that you can be a problem solver for the organization, not just in writing a piece, but in curating artistic programs, developing educational programs, doing civic practice work. Like, these are ways that you can actually become a catalyst within the organization, which is a really different thing than just turning in a piece and walking away. And Dan, I know that's something you've done a lot in your career. I'm curious how you think about those skills and how you develop them.
So, kind of in terms of like when to say yes, when to say no to a piece, it's a difficult calculus, but something that I would say, we start with the adage that, everyone's always trying to get artists to work for free. So the first thing is that eventually we want to be in a place where we're not getting a raw deal for ourselves constantly, right? However, we also have to provide value. And when we're first starting out, there may be a period in which we don't have a ton of experience and a proven track record and value to command getting paid $5,000 to write a piece. So a certain amount of singing for your dinner, I think is okay. The way I recommend doing it is that that's acceptable for maybe like a first project. It's good to lay the groundwork of letting people know that typically I might like to, do this project for around $1,000. But, in this case, I really like to work with you. And, if this goes well, would you be open to future projects? And they might not be open, but at least it lets them know that that's not a change. And it lets them know what your value is, and also that you're being gracious. So that can be something too. Just make sure that you don't get strung along. But something I'd also say is that everyone needs a balanced diet, because very few composers just do one piece at a time for a year or a couple years. We often have a couple things at once, or we change, we do different kinds of pieces. And I would think about, everyone needs different things to be satisfied in different ratios. But some of the things you might look at are, you need those pieces that are going to be incredibly creatively satisfying. But not all of them have to be pieces that are going to get a lot of additional performances or make the most money from them. They could just do that. And you could have some other pieces that are designed to be incredibly portable and designed to be really, really easy to put together. And those pieces do a different kind of thing for you. So I think that you want to look at, what is this experience doing for me? What am I getting out of this? And also, what am I adding to my catalog by creating this piece? Do I need another slow piece with an amorphous beginning with a high A that gradually turns into a G and a B flat, and then gradually, we all know that. It could be that actually this will help you diagnose, you know what? I don't have any pieces that declare their intent really clearly with a strong rhythmic melody from the beginning. That might be a challenge. It's just, you can get ideas just from noticing what you haven't done. So those are some great things, both creatively and on the business side, that might be able to help.
Yeah, that makes good sense. And that sort of mirrors a question that we had submitted in advance, which was basically, until now, most of the time my music hasn't really been, or that when my music has been played, I haven't received money for it. And I wouldn't want to have less opportunities to get my music programmed if I asked to get paid for it. How can I find the balance? So it sounds like you're articulating an understanding of what value that experience is bringing to you through creating a work you wouldn't have otherwise done, through a type of relationship with a particular organization or artist, as a way of determining value and also balancing that with some of the other things. Is there anything else you might add to that question?
Well, that's a great summary, Melissa. I would just add on top of that, and my heart goes out to whoever, and probably more than one person who's experiencing that. Also think about ways that you can turn no, this doesn't work for me into, how about this other thing that does work for both of us? That's a lot better. So the thing is, you might feel in yourself all of this, oh gosh, I'm going to have this big conversation and duke it out and assert myself. It could just be a case where you say, you know what, I so appreciate your interest. I'm at a point right now where I need to be getting this amount of money to do these kind of projects because I have this crazy habit of eating. I so appreciate your interest and I'd like to work with you. Could we look at a consortium? Do you have other friends who play the horn who might want to look at going in on this together and share? And then if you can be a problem solver, position yourself as someone who's positively helping to find a solution, that's always going to be better. Great stuff happens by collaboration creatively, but good conversations happen collaboratively too. So I think if you can go into it like that, and also, a great technique is appeal. It's okay to draw attention to the fact that you have done some pieces in the free for this person. You don't have to rub it in a nasty way, but it's okay to assert your value and then to ask somebody, how could you help? Is there a solution? What do you expect that I would be able to do? And sometimes you have to tell people, how do you expect me to eat? So, but that's something I might reserve. Yeah, that's one. That's a little hot tamale I might keep if things get a little bit hot and you feel like, sometimes there's conversations where people don't see your value. So it's okay to walk away. I would just say, try and do the softer things first and see if that helps. And that way you'll know. And if somebody's just real jerk, maybe let's, that's not a great person to work with anyway. Because the best collaborator is going to be somebody who's investing equally. So
yeah. So you're basically giving permission to walk away from people who you don't need to have in your life, because they're not going to
absolutely build your community of people who you love working with. And then if there's people that you don't like very much, instead of thinking about them all the time, fighting them, sparring with them, just spend more time with the people that you like. Develop that.
Mm-hmm. That makes good sense. Well, we talked about some of the abstract ideas, some of the ways that we can earn in addition to straight up writing music commissions and all of that. We've sent some great notes in the chat as well from everybody, ranging from teaching artistry to music librarian, music criticism, all kinds of things. So thank you for some wonderful suggestions. I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about how the working budget for a composer actually looks at various stages in their career.
Of course. And I'm so glad someone gave a shout out to music librarians. They are some of the coolest people in the world. They are composers' best friends. Just buy them treats and gifts and learn from them. I'll come back to that later. So, before we look at some actual budgets, I just want to frame this by saying that, we have a couple different categories of income for composers that you can expect. Some of you may be experiencing this sweet cornucopia already. Some of you may be saying, what's that? But that's okay. Usually there's a combination, and we're always learning and developing kind of new ways that we can make a buck from doing what we love. So there's direct payment, and that can be from getting a paid commission, from getting paid to do teaching or for a talk. That's exchange for service. There's also the whole process of sales and rentals. For existing pieces. So typically rentals are going to be for orchestra, occasionally for wind ensemble too, for large ensemble, and then sales are going to be typically for everything else. And we can talk a little bit more later about some of the ways that can be handled. And then the third category of, again, passive income is going to be looking at royalties. So this can include ASCAP, BMI, or CSAC, if anyone out there is still with them. And it can be also mechanicals. That's the Harry Fox agency that's looking at things that come in from other kinds of recorded sources. And then there's also sync rights. So you might write a lot of music that people want to use in commercials. You could write this one piece that just becomes the new face of Peloton's ad campaign. Lucky you, right? But there's all kinds of ways to make money. And some of this can be just licensing and royalties on works that have already been written. So one of the best ways that you can make the best kind of income, not always the most income, but the best kind of income, is by being a composer, because composers write pieces where no one may love that piece at first. No one may pay us very much. We may write that piece for free, but if it's successful, we can make a lot of money long-term, and we never have to do anything again other than just supporting that piece with the considerable efforts of responding to that interest. So, that said, I think maybe let's take a look at two different sample budgets from composers representing kind of two different career stages. So thanks, Melissa. So one of the things that I want to talk about here, that composers have so many different incomes. Right now, we just want to go down again. Here's this list of some different ways that you can make teaching work for you, private lessons, etc. Let's go down to expenditures. And so one thing I just want to highlight here is that this should be no stranger to anyone. There are a lot of different expenses we have, and I want to just highlight some of the things here that you need to consider, because this is not a revenue neutral stream. And we're going to get to some equipment and stuff later. There's ways to do this without totally breaking the bank. But a lot of things I want to highlight here, how many things are potentially tax deductible, including things like gifts in certain contexts. So this can be a really good area to work with a professional, especially somebody who has experience with musicians in the arts, can understand that can be really helpful. But another thing I want to underline here is just realizing that things like professional memberships or things like hardware, software, there's a certain cost of doing business. So use this as a start and just take a stock of like what your yearly expenses are. Are there certain things that recur every year, like website hosting fees? Are there certain things that are more one-time investment and last a long time until they need to be replaced? So that can be helpful. So jumping ahead, I want to look at these budgets now, because I think that's going to be kind of most illuminating. So one of the things that I wanted to do is put together kind of looking at two different composers. And the first is a composer that we call emerging, whatever that means. You're coming out of your chrysalis. That might be somebody who's just finishing school or has recently finished school and is at that relative beginning of that professional career. And then the second composer is somebody who might say mid-career, who's been out of school, who's been established, who's maybe hopefully got a couple things going. And right off the bat, we see that there's a lot of differences here. So I'd be curious what you notice, first of all, and feel free to share any comments in the chat as you're looking about this, about the differences between these two hypothetical composers. As you do that, one of the things I want to talk about is the difference between active and passive income. Notice how there's more kinds of income stream for the mid-career composer. And there's also a pivot from getting paid only for the time and effort you put in to gradually being paid more because of who you are and what you know. And that being weighted more towards, the opportunity for speaking engagements. People don't want you to hold forth on a topic if you haven't done anything that backs that up. People don't want you to be reviewing CDs if you don't have a perspective that would be valuable and expert on that level. So that's like a natural progression. But I also want to just point out too, how if you look at some of this too, at some of the expenditures, there's certain things that are investments here, like headshots, materials, so we're talking about that. Kind of keeping track of those can be difficult because they're often like larger investments. And also there's certain things that are easy to avoid doing because they're kind of elective. So headshots, the amount of composers that have a really great piece of music, that have a pretty good looking website, that have some old photo of them from their college student ID is boggling to me. So you don't always have to be like, super posh depending on where your career level is, but those are great investments. So, and in this day of iPhones, if everyone can do something. So kind of one thing I want to highlight here is that if you look at both of these composers, you look at their totals, are either of these composers likely able to make a very comfortable living solely from these activities? Maybe not necessarily. And the thing is, the amount of composers who are able to live very comfortably doing just composing activities are relatively few. It's also very possible. It's very possible. It's just not necessarily the norm. And I think that there's a lot of ways to supplement that. I think the most common would be there's often ways of teaching, of course, and that can be either privately at colleges. But I just want to highlight this in looking at this budget. I don't want composers looking at this to come into this saying, oh gosh, here's two composers and they got it all worked out. And that's typical. And if I don't do that, and if I'm somewhat less than that, I'm atypical. That's not at all true. I think what we see as the norm is composers combining composition with other skills. And those can be other kind of musical skills that are related to composition, or they can be totally outside of that. But I'm curious if there's any kind of questions about here or anything that people noticed that they want to talk about in this mockup. I just wanted to put some actual numbers in here so it wasn't totally abstract.
For sure. And as a reminder, you're welcome to ask questions in the Q&A or raise your hand in the participant window, and we can bring you up on screen with us too if you would like to join. I just saw Charles Ives sold insurance, and there was somebody else in the chat earlier who is a composer attorney, which you're hired, by the way. Thanks so much. So, there are a lot of different ways of doing this, but I really appreciate that you're really highlighting that the ability to create a portfolio career that is in line with your skill set and your interests and how you want to spend your time is both a necessary thing, but also something that can provide some relief. Because I could anticipate that if you are constantly on the hamster wheel of commissions, as wonderful as that sounds, there may be some burnout that comes with that too.
Totes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great. So we're seeing some comments in the chat, not so much in the way of questions. So if you'd like to move on to the next thing, is there anything else that you want to share about the budget itself before we stop the share?
I think I just really wanted people to get a sense of what's like. I would encourage you all, if you have not built a budget for yourself, this is a great weekend to start. But it's a good time to start thinking about budgets. Can start really small. One thing I learned from Melissa Ngan is that budgets are great tools for imagining. So the whole point of doing it is it's not something to do when it's dead after the fact. It's to help you imagine and to vary that in the future. So this can be a really good way that you can take a stock and again, reflect back, see what the numbers actually are, because they certainly don't lie.
For sure. And I also see that we have Daniel with his hand up. So since I know we have some helpers behind the screen to get Daniel on the screen, Daniel, feel free to join us. We're going to bring you on.
Hi, Daniel.
Hello, hello. Good to see you.
Oh, gosh, I feel so... For as long as I've been using Zoom during this whole pandemic, I still am pretty bumbly with the computer.
We are right there with you, man. Every time I have to go back and forth from screen share, I sweat. So you're
First, thank you guys so much for this. This is really great. One, I just wanted to say, I hope you don't mind me calling you Dan.
Oh, of course, that's great.
Oh, okay, well, Dan. One, I really love the budget thing you put up there. I set a template many years ago. It's really necessary for taxes. It's just, and it helps you when you have to do invoices, it helps you have an idea of what it is. I really like that. I wanted to bring up one thing when you were speaking about having all these different entries into being a gainfully employed composer, right? One thing that I've frequently run into is starting out, I did a similar thing, copyist work, producing work, and I developed nothing like crazy, but a pretty good career doing arranging, composing, conducting, producing, things like this. And over the last, pretty much since the pandemic, a little bit before, I really tried to wean myself off of that. And it's hard because you have to pay rent, you've got to do this. So you get a call, it's a really good call, it's good money. And it's great because I've learned a lot, but I've kind of learned everything I need to learn, not everything, but it's time for me to start moving on, doing more commissions and things like this. And it's been really hard to be viewed that way. I've actually done a thing where I switched, I write under a nom de plume because I am looked at as a composer. It's like, oh, you're a composer. You don't know music business stuff. And then as an arranger, it's like, oh, you're just an arranger. You're not. So I wonder if you've met that at all, and if you have any just thoughts on that. Thank you.
Look, first of all, Daniel, thank you so much for sharing. And I definitely empathize with that position. I think that there's a lot of people who are are kind of dealing with that. It's so hard to get to that point that you've cultivated. And it's often takes so much energy that we're almost just at this loss of what do we do to get the next step. But I think that you're probably on the cusp of some of those things working out. And I think you identified a couple of really interesting points that I think will be really useful for everyone watching too. How do you deal with when you have an identity, which might even be a very good identity in a certain perception? How do you deal with kind of people getting locked into that and their willingness to be led to new areas where you can work? And then you brought up, something that's really hard. And one of those things is that we often need to leave room for opportunity. We have to close the old chapter before we're able to see what's on the new one. But we have this nasty habit of needing to live. And it's very difficult, not just tempting, but it's outright necessary to be able to do those things. I mean, it's often a case where we can feel pulled in some very different directions at once. So I just want to underline, like, I hear a lot of that. And it's something that I think that we all struggle with at different stages. It sounds like some of what you're talking about too might be as a result of other kinds of success. It sounds like, as you said, you've gotten known, you've gotten really, really kind of almost set or seen to be somebody who provides certain kind of things. And it sounds like you're interested in getting known and kind of get kind of more interest in those other kind of things. One of the things I think about is that when we have relationships that can often be very transactional in the music world, there's so many quick gigs, checking and stuff like that, that can often happen. It's very easy for people to get locked into seeing us in just one kind of way. So the overall philosophical thing that I think is that I think the more that we can create non-transactional relationships and also try and pull things away from that as much as possible, I think that gives the biggest opportunity for people maybe seeing us in a new kind of way like that. So, one of the things that could be interesting is that a lot of times as composers, when we want to be known in a certain kind of way, some of the essential things that we just need to do are making sure that we're doing the best job sharing and telling that story. So, I would also be curious about, are there changes in like website and materials that would go out? Is there something even like a general notice sent to everyone about, actually, I'm making a shift and here's some exciting new projects? Or I think sometimes just the simple act of really letting everyone know. And that can be times when we need help specifically, or it can also just be letting you know there's a shift. But I think that that's something that we often maybe don't feel comfortable to engage fully. I would say too, the number of times that I'm working with sometimes like student composers and someone will ask me about, how do I help getting set up to do copying? And then I'll call them to do copying. And they're like, how did you know? And I said, well, I didn't know it until you told me. I said, you should put that up on your website. So you're a composer and then people need to be aware. And of course, I'm sure that this is a lot of this stuff is things you're doing. But I would be curious to ask you, kind of knowing a little bit more, when you're having interactions, like where is the point where stuff hits the wall? Is it that you're able to get in a conversation talking about maybe doing something that's more kind of creative composition related? And is it that you kind of like get colder interest there? Or is there difficulty getting in that conversation and setting the space? I'm kind of curious where you encounter resistance and how.
Both. Mostly though, it's getting in that conversation. I think you just mentioned something that really clicked with me. It's the people that I have around me look at me as a transactional contact. He can do this for me. And that's what you want. When you're doing arranging, when you're doing pre-production, production, you're doing something for somebody. And that really struck a chord with me, is that a lot of the contacts that I have, and I've been trying to, some of them developing, especially here, contacts that are not transactional in that way, or they don't see me that way. But that's usually what happens, is there's a little coldness of, oh, you wanted that. Okay, so you can't do anything for my project. It's like, well, actually, I was asking you to do something for my thing. But yeah, I think well, you nailed it right there. Is a lot of the relationships I have are transactional, and I think that's a great point.
What I might just say is like one other thought is that, and again, some of this is tough because one thing I want to emphasize is that this isn't like a situation that you have perfect control of. You're doing a really good job in a tough situation. Some of the only thing that might help is the more that you can create a different kind of environment and pattern for interacting. It doesn't always need to be explicit, but we're such creatures of habit. If there's something that you can do to kind of set the tone to meet in a different way. So for example, if normally you're emailing quickly back and forth or something like that about a project, maybe slow it down and say, I'd love to talk to you about something else and it's totally different. Like, would you meet in the park or something and go over this? I want to or I want to take you to this museum and show you this painting that's inspiring this piece that I've been generating on. And I think it might be, but if you can do something to maybe create a different way of interacting than you normally do, that might lead to a different outcome, coupled with those other strategies. But it can be hard. One other thing I'll underline too, and of course, I don't mean this to be like a negative if you get in a situation, but the other part of it is that we always want to be really careful thinking about how people come into contact with us. And sometimes we're in cases where we have a certain situation and it's a good situation. It sounds like, developing those other skills was absolutely the right thing to do. But if there's ever situations like, there was a time once where I became known to a conductor of some importance because I was apprenticing for another composer. And it ended up kind of doing that thing where I could never, ever be seen as that. And of course, sometimes we could use those strategies and try to get out. Sometimes there might be certain things, especially certain really important things. So, I think for what you're describing, you probably have a very good chance of being able to change that perception. But I think for very major opportunities, those are some things that you always want to handle right. And I think you always want to try and set planting as much as possible that you do those things. And even if you don't, get really talkative about them until later, I think the earlier you can let people know that you have things that you're going on besides just being their dutiful copyist or dutiful arranger, I think that gives you some of that ability. But it can be very tough. Some people don't see that, but I think the more you can give them some chances to and frequent opportunities to engage differently, it just might shake them a little bit loose from their preconceptions. Good luck.
Thank you very much, Dan. I actually, it's really some food for thought of the way I interact, and I appreciate it. I've got to get going. I want to thank you very much, Melissa. Thank everybody else. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. Nice to see you.
Thank you, Daniel. It was nice to see you. And so, Dan, coming back now, I know that there's some people who you think might be models for some of the things we've been talking about today. And I just want to give a little space to share some of those success stories. And first of all, I want to thank Daniel again for coming up, because I think there are a lot of people in the chat and watching who probably identify very strongly with what he's experiencing. So a few examples, if you don't mind.
Of course. So, and I think of several people. So rather than pick like two people and go in depth, and I see that we're also running out of time, I'm going to mention several people, and I would encourage you to check up on all of these, especially any name who's new to you, because I think these are all some folks who do really great work in different ways. So Jennifer Higdon, mentioned before, is amazing, and her founding of Lauden Press with her partner Cheryl, I think is not only such a great example of a successful music business, but a great family business. These are two people who deeply love and respect about each other and have managed to build that in their life in a really healthy way. And I think Jennifer is also just an incredibly great citizen. She's very communicative. She sent me some of her recent music when I was in my undergrad after I met her once, just like, hey, Dan, I have this new piece that came out. Thought you might want to hear it. And I was like, I'm a nobody. I'm a student at a school in Ohio. I'm like, oh my gosh. And so she's somebody who I think really has a lot of the personal skills and the warmth and the energy to sustain the kind of activity she supported. Daniel Remain, or DBR, is somebody that I've always looked up to, as a composer, as a performer and improviser, and as an activist. And I think that really comes through on his website, and also how he handles himself and a lot of his business arrangement with Sozo artists. So I think also want to underline, Daniel's someone who's a hybrid composer performer. And that's something that I think more and more people are doing, whether they're composers writing for themselves, or I think that integration is something that is a really rising trend, and Daniel's a great model. I want to mention a couple specialists outside of orchestra, just to make sure, give a little balance here. But I think about composer John Mackey, who is a great composer all around, but has become particularly noted in the band world. Check out his website. Look at the way he's got his repertoire all graded. That's somebody who really understands the market and the system and the situation for the kinds of educators who'll be buying his music. So I think that can be really helpful. And if you don't write in that genre at all, you could still learn a lot from John and the way he's put attention to that. Someone else in a different genre, composer Abby Bettinas, Minnesota-based, is a choral composer who has an excellent catalog, incredibly well laid out. And again, like, this can be a good thing. It's also helpful if you're writing orchestra music that features choir. These are just good format. So look for good role models that you can kind of steal some good tips on. Nobody owns those things, so it's not plagiarism as long as you don't steal their notes. Just take note of what they're doing.
That is so beautiful. Oh, sorry to interrupt, please.
Oh, I just quickly, I want to give a shout out to Derek Bermel, ACO's artistic director, another great composer, performer, and someone who's incredibly active as a curator. I just want to give a shout out to Derek's website. Does a really beautiful job showing the different kinds of things he does and show how they work in relation to each other. I also want to underline Jimmy Lopez, who I believe is ACO's Houston Earshot mentor this season, but I think really masterful integration of media features and layout of kind of media on the site. So just a whole bunch of folks to go check out.
100%. And Patricia, I just want to uplift what you said that, commissioning and presenting local composers is a really interesting model. I actually was in a conversation with the Mellon Foundation that they've seen that relationships between orchestras and local composers or any arts organization and local artists can be some of the most sustainable in the long term. And they would know more than anyone, having funded a lot of these programs that are systemic. So Dan, this has been wonderful. We have one question here from Robert, who has his hand raised. So in our last few minutes, I'd like to invite Robert to the screen, and that will close our session for today.
Great.
Hi, Robert, how are you?
I'm fine. Let me get myself on screen here.
Please do.
Good to see you, Robert.
Hi, Dan, how are you?
Wonderful.
I just wanted to say that, I'm sort of approaching this from the other end of my career, having been a composer now for 50 years. But for the first 30, I ran music schools for a living. And I found it to be a mixed bag in terms of performing and promoting my own music. I was very fortunate to be around great artists all the time, but when I was the president of Manhattan School of Music, everything was very fraught in terms of having my own performances. And when I planned to retire 10 years ago, I basically discussed the idea of rebranding myself. And rebranding myself for me was actually taking my bio and turning it upside down. That is to say, starting my bio as American composer Robert Sirota and burying the administrative stuff, which I respect and honor, in the bottom. And this gets to what the other Dan was talking about. In other words, we tend in our profession to think about people in one or two different ways. And now basically I'm trying to actually make a living as a composer. And I think your budget's pretty good. but even for people who command larger commission fees, it's very difficult to be a full-time composer. It depends on how fast you write and how much energy you have to do the work. So I do composing and arranging now as a kind of full-time profession. I don't know how useful that is for everybody, but I thought I would talk about the matter of branding yourself. If you're a choral composer, brand yourself as a choral composer, not using your college bio necessarily. And I think we need to work on our bios almost on a year-to-year basis and decide what it is we want them to tell people about ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, this is beautiful because it mirrors exactly the experience that Daniel was having, and that Dan gave him that advice to what you want to grow in your career. You have to put out there in the world in an intentional way. You need to tell people, and in the way that you describe, frame your bio that way. So many of us write bios and say, person seeks to blah.
Right.
Get rid of the seeks to and just say what you do.
Right. It's not a CV. It's not a resume. It's a statement of purpose and of the skills that you have for that purpose. And what I'm trying to say is, somebody put in the chat, age has nothing to do with it. It sort of doesn't. The struggle never ends, and you have to sort of keep recasting your persona, both for the public and also for the musical world, because there's a lot of people out there, a lot of great talent. People need to know what particular thing you have to offer, and that you're still out there in the market.
That's some great insight, Robert. And I think that's really helpful, especially the way that you kind of totally revamped your website and stuff like that. I think that's a lot of really helpful advice to like Daniel, where he was in his stage, and a lot of others. And I'm curious, we're about to wrap up, but as you've kind of gone farther in this transformation and had some success, do you feel that you're at a point with a balance of composing and arranging where those two worlds are do those two worlds mix for you? Do you end up
actually, I'd like to seek to do a little more arranging with really great artists. A lot of, I'm working with some crossover art, what we used to call crossover artists. Now they're just artists. I have at least the luxury of picking and choosing projects that I want to do, although with COVID, nobody's had enough to do for a while. But what I see, my son's writing film music now. He started in a string quartet. My daughter Nadia is a composer, composer now. I think this is the age of creative diversification for composers, and figuring out what you do well and what you really like to do, I think makes it easier to actually profit from what you're doing.
That's fantastic. Thanks for sharing, Robert.
Because it's kind of infectious. People want to work with you because you're so excited about the work.
Yeah, thank you so much, Robert, for joining us. That's a beautiful way to end for today. We really appreciate your kind words and presence. Dan, any final words before we toss back to Aiden to close us off?
Well, first of all, I just want to thank you and ACO and everyone who joined so much. This has been really fun. And I just want to close by saying there's a formula I want to give you that can apply to several situations. And it's to be a problem solver. People don't do things because they see how they matter to you. They do them because you make them matter to both of you. So if you can have a clear sense of who you are, a clear sense of who that other person or organization is, and create a point of connection, that's going to be really good. So think about that, and think about it's less important to press a CD in someone's hand than to make them interested in wanting the CD. They'll ask for you. So what you're really trying to do is to be telling the story of all the great work you're doing. Make sure that you share that in a variety of ways. And in closing, I would say that people are going to interact with you so many different ways. And sometimes they'll remember what you talk about. But as Maya Angelou says, they'll almost always remember how you make them feel. So focus on that. That is some money in the bank. And this has been really nuts and bolts, but I just want to end with some feels. So keep that up. That is your most important capital and your reputation as a composer.
Well, Dan, we are so grateful to you. You have made us feel so much more confident about the future. And Aiden, welcome back. Feel free to take it away.
Thank you so much to our panelists and to, to My Little Pony, and also everyone that asked questions and that participated today. We really appreciate having you. We shared in the chat 2 different links. There's a survey so that you can tell us how you felt about this and how you'd like us to continue these webinars, what topics you'd like to see, how much you've learned from it, the format, all of that. And then we will be on Discord for the next few minutes answering additional questions if you'd like to join us there. Next week, we will be back with another webinar. We will be joined by a soprano and philanthropy expert, Yolanda F. Johnson, and that will be 3 p.m. again, fundraising for ensembles. You will receive an email following this later in the week with the survey, with a recording of today, with the resources from today, all of the links. So if you keep an eye out for that, you'll get that from us. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to our panelists, and everyone have a great day.